All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back here again. We're going to talk about the third day at the Battle of Gettysburg and finish up our virtual trip, our virtual tour of the Gettysburg battlefield. Now, on the third day of the battle, Robert E. Lee decided to attack the Union center using one of his generals, General George Pickett, and his division of soldiers to attack that particular area of the Union line. And so it became known as Pickett's Charge, and it was a disaster. The Confederate soldiers had to march across open ground, and they had to go against Union cannon firing into that open area, as well as Union troops behind a stone wall. It was a very similar result as what happened to the Union at the Battle of Fredericksburg, except this time it was the Confederates who were attacking that stone wall. Um, it becomes known as one of the bravest charges in military history for America, but also a failed charge. And so we're going to go to a couple tour sites here to take a look at what happened on that day. All right, so our next stop is the high water mark, and it's called the high water mark because this location is the location where Robert E. Lee's forces were focusing on. They were focusing on this area of trees, and the Confederates were marching from, and I'm going to zoom out here so you can see this. The Confederates were marching from all the way across this open field where these trees are. So they were over here at these trees, and they were going to march all the way across, and their focus, their aim, their goal was this area of trees. And so that area of trees is pretty important today still, and it is still one of those things that people remember about the battle. And today there is a monument there called the High Water Mark. And it's called the High Water Mark because at this point, just before this charge is made, the Confederacy was at their highest point. They had won battles at Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, First Bull Run, Second Bull Run, the 7 Days battles. They had won all of these battles, and it looked like they were moving towards winning the war. But after this point of the Battle of Gettysburg, it was so devastating a battle to the Confederates that after this point they never achieved the same success that they had. And so this is the high water mark is that high point for the Confederacy. And so at this tour stop, there is a monument with some cannons. I believe this is a Bible, but I don't remember exactly what that book is meant to be. Um, and there's a fence around that clump of trees so that people don't go in there. But this is the area known as the high water mark. This is the focus of Pickett's charge. And just a handful of soldiers ever made it to this point before they were pushed back by the Union. Okay, so that's the high water mark. Now our next stop here is the Union soldiers' view of Pickett's charge. Union soldiers would have been lined up all along where this road is and along this stone wall. And you can see the stone wall is right here. And it kind of goes around this way. If I were to click on this, better pause it here. Hold on. Okay. When I click on this, it shows you the viewpoint for a Union soldier. So there's the stone wall. Union soldiers would have been there, and they would have watched Confederates come out of those trees and march all the way across this open field. They actually would have marched until they got to this road. And then when they got to that road, they would have came into at a full run. Okay. Now, this clump of trees right here is known as the angle, and the Confederates actually pushed their way all the way to this stone wall, and they even were able to get past that stone wall. So if I zoom in a little bit further here, one of the Confederate generals, Lewis Armistead, actually was able to scale that wall and break a gap into the Union line, and it was working to turn these Union cannon towards the Union soldiers when he was shot dead. And so there's a monument today that shows where General Lewis Armistead was wounded and then eventually died. Okay, so this is the area where the Union soldiers were fighting off Pickett's charge, right in this area here. Okay, let's move on to our next location. Now we're moving over to the Confederate side. You can see this area here that's kind of tinted in red, that's the area of Pickett's charge, and there would have been Confederate soldiers wounded all along that reddish area there. All right, we're stopping here at our next stop. This is the Virginia Memorial, and you can see someone has made a 3D model of that memorial. At this memorial, there's a statue of Robert E. Lee on top of his horse. From this position, Robert E. Lee watched Pickett's charge, and he also greeted those soldiers coming back from the charge, wounded, and those that made it through. And as they came back, he kept saying, "It's all my fault. It is all my fault." And so at this memorial, the Virginia Memorial, is where he watched Pickett's charge on that third day of the battle. And there's a close-up of what it looks like in real life. Okay, we move on to our next stop here. Our next stop is the North Carolina Memorial. And this memorial is dedicated to the North Carolina soldiers who fought during the Civil War. And particularly at this battle, North Carolina suffered the heaviest Confederate casualties. Some argue that it's the largest amount of casualties for an entire state throughout the entire war. They suffered about 82%, and that's about the same that the 1st Minnesota did. So here is the statue, the North Carolina Monument. What else is unique about this monument is that it was sculpted by a man named Gutzon Borglum, the same guy who sculpted Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. And so he sculpted this monument, and there you can see a picture of it and what it looks like if you were to go there. All right. Now, after the battle, the two armies basically left this area with soldiers lying dead and wounded on the field. And the town of Gettysburg really had no way to deal with those bodies. And so many of those bodies were buried right where they fell on the battlefield. And a lot of people started to say, hey, you know what, we need to bury these soldiers in a cemetery. As gruesome as it sounds, some of the graves were not very deep. And so because of that, so as I was saying, they needed a place to bury these soldiers because the graves weren't very deep and the bodies started to smell. And they needed to bury these soldiers officially in deep graves. And so they decided to make a national cemetery near the Battle of Gettysburg site. And what you see here is that cemetery. November of 1863, remember the Battle of Gettysburg took place July 1st, 2nd, 3rd of 1863. November of that year, the cemetery is ready to be dedicated. And Abraham Lincoln is asked to say a few short words, and he shows up and he gives probably the most famous speech of his life, the Gettysburg Address, one of the most famous speeches in American history. There's a monument today marking the spot where Abraham Lincoln gave that speech, and that's what you see right here. And so I want to show you that monument. This is the monument that marks the spot of the Gettysburg Address. And the soldiers that are buried here all circle around this monument as if they're in a theater. So you can see the grave sites here. They are all facing that monument like an amphitheater. Okay. Our next stop is the site where the Minnesota soldiers are buried. And so we're scrolling to that point right now, and we're going to pause here. So right in this area is where the Minnesota soldiers are buried. And what's unique about it is the Minnesota graves, there's a flower and a monument there placed by the surviving members of the 1st Minnesota. And so here's the flower pot that is there dedicated to those soldiers, and you can see their gravestones behind it. And then there is a little marker that tells how many people are buried there. Some of the names, if they could identify the soldiers, are on the gravestones. Others would be unknown. And so here is another view of those Minnesota graves. Okay. So 52 of the 262 soldiers were buried here. The rest were either wounded and died later, or they were buried on the field and haven't been found. Okay, so that's where the Minnesota graves are located on the battlefield. And that is our Gettysburg tour. I want to show you as we finish here, I'd like to show you the path of the 1st Minnesota and what they took to get up to uh, Gettysburg. And so if I zoom out here, you'll be able to see that. So as I zoom away, you can see the town of Gettysburg today. There's the downtown. And if I roll back this way, all right. So that blue line indicates where the 1st Minnesota marched from between June 3rd and the actual Battle of Gettysburg. You can see right here, overnight, they marched from just outside of Pennsylvania all the way in to where the battle took place. Okay, so hopefully you learned a few things about the Battle of Gettysburg and saw a few pictures, and hopefully you enjoyed this little Google Earth tour of the battlefield of Gettysburg. You can go on to Google Maps, and you can see these different things or different pictures. You can go to that battlefield and look at some of the other pictures that people have put up on Google Maps, and you can take a look at some of their pictures. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you